The country house appeared through the snow-laden trees like something from a fairy tale. Its stone walls and steep roof, dusted with white, smoke rising from the chimney, indicating that the caretaker was maintaining minimal heat during the winter months. Carlos parked the truck behind a stand of evergreens, where it would be hidden from casual observation, then helped us unload our few belongings and make our way to the front hash. The funeral in the snow fell like silent tears from the gray sky, each flake dancing in the frigid air before landing gently on the grieving shoulders that followed the coffin. I walked with measured steps, holding my little Mateo against my chest, feeling the warmth of his small body contrasting with the cold that penetrated through my black coat. The funeral procession moved like a dark river through the white landscape, and I could feel dozens of eyes upon me, weighing, judging, calculating. The church bells rang mournfully in the distance, their bronze voices echoing across the valley where my husband's family had lived for generations. I pulled my shawl tighter around Mateo, protecting him from both the cold and the hostile glances that seemed to cut through the winter air like knives. My breath formed small clouds in front of my face as I whispered quiet lullabies. I'm calm, though my own heart raced with an anxiety I couldn't quite name. Behind me, I could hear the whispered conversations of relatives I barely knew. Voices that carried on the wind despite their attempts at discretion. Words floated to my ears like poisonous snowflakes. Outsider, fortune hunter, that child. Each syllable felt like a small wound, and I found myself walking faster, desperate to reach the warmth and supposed safety of the family home, where we would gather after laying my beloved Eduardo. The cemetery gates loomed ahead, wreathed in iron and ice, and I watched as the pallbearers, Eduardo's cousins and uncles, carried his casket with practiced solemnity. How many funerals had this family seen? How many generations had walked this same path through snow, mourning their dead while secretly calculating inheritance and legacy? I shivered, and it wasn't entirely from the cold. As we approached the gravesite, I caught sight of Dona Mercedes, Eduardo's mother, standing rigid as a statue at the edge of the gathering crowd. Her black dress seemed to absorb all light, and her face was a mask of controlled grief that revealed nothing of her. She had barely spoken to me since Eduardo's sudden death 3 days ago, offering only the most perfunctory condolences before turning her attention to the funeral arrangement, which she had taken over with an efficiency that left me feeling like a stranger in my own tragedy. The priest began his solemn words, speaking of eternal rest and divine mercy, but I found it difficult to concentrate. Mateo stirred in my arms, making the soft sounds that meant he would soon need feeding, and I wondered how I would manage in the coming days. Eduardo had promised me that everything would be fine, that his family would accept us both in time, but now, surrounded by their cold stares and whispered judgment, I felt more alone than ever. The wind picked up, sending snow swirling around us like ghosts, and I heard a voice carried on the bitter air. It was Dona Mercedes, speaking to a woman I didn't recognize, her words carefully modulated but clear enough for me to catch. That baby will inherit nothing. The phrase hit me like a physical blow, and I felt my knees. I looked down at Mateo's innocent face, his eyes closed in peace, unaware that his legitimacy, his future, his very place in this family was being questioned even as his father was being lowered into the frozen ground. A spark of something I couldn't quite identify ignited in my chest. Was it anger, fear, determination? Perhaps all three. I had loved Eduardo with all my heart, and he had loved us both. Whatever documents existed, whatever his final wishes were, I knew with absolute certainty that he would never have left his son without provision. But standing there in the snow, surrounded by hostile faces and whispered threats, I realized that knowing and proving were two very different things. The ceremony concluded with the hollow sound of dirt hitting the coffin lid, muffled by the snow but still carrying a finality that made my heart contract. One by one, the mourners began to disperse, heading back to their cars and the warmth of the family home where a reception awaited. I lingered a moment longer, placing my gloved hand on the temporary marker that bore Eduardo's name and date, silently promising him that I would protect our son no matter what obstacles lay ahead. As I finally turned to leave, I noticed how the family members had already grouped themselves into clusters, speaking in low voices that fell silent whenever I passed near. Their black forms against the white snow reminded me of crows gathering around carrion, and I pulled Mateo closer, suddenly desperate to escape their predatory attention. The path back to the cars seemed impossibly long, each step taking me further into a world where I was clearly unwelcome, where my child's future hung in the balance, based on the whims and machinations of people who saw us as nothing more than inconvenient reminders of their precious Eduardo's poor judgment in matters of the heart. The reception at the ancestral home felt like walking into a fortress of cold marble and colder hearts. The grand foyer, with its crystal chandeliers and oil painting of stern-faced ancestors, seemed designed to intimidate rather than welcome. I stood uncertainly in the doorway, Mateo still in my arms, watching as family members shed their coats and immediately began gravitating toward each other in familiar clusters, leaving me isolated like an island in a sea of black wool and whispered conversation. I made my way toward what I hoped was the main sitting room, following the sound of clinking glasses and subdued voices. The house felt impossibly large, each room leading to another in a maze of wealth and tradition that spoke of centuries of accumulated power. Eduardo had brought me here only once shortly after our wedding, and even then I had felt like a museum visitor rather than a family member. Now, without his protective presence, the sensation was magnified tenfold. Clara. The voice belonged to Eduardo's aunt, Isabella, a thin woman with sharp features who had always looked at me as if I were a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. "How are you managing?" The question seemed genuine enough, but there was something in her tone, a measuring quality that made me wonder what answer she was hoping to. "I'm taking it one day at a time," I replied, adjusting Mateo in my arms as he began to fuss. He was such a good man. I know he would want me strong. I searched her face for some sign of warmth, some acknowledgement of shared grief, but found only polite distance. "Yes, well," Isabella said, her eyes flicking to Mateo, and then away. "Grief affects us all differently. Some people find it easier to move on than others." Before I could ask what she meant by that, she had already turned away to join a conversation with two other relatives I didn't recognize. I wandered deeper into the house, past rooms filled with people I should have known but didn't, past conversations that stopped when I approached and resumed when I moved away. The feeling of being an intruder in my own life grew stronger with each passing minute. These people had known Eduardo since birth, had shared decades of memories and experiences that I could never be part of. But surely, I told myself, that didn't negate the love he and I had shared, or the family we had created together. In the kitchen, I found a quiet corner where I could feed Mateo without feeling like I was performing for an audience. The cook, an elderly woman named Rosa, who had worked for the family for over 30 years, brought me a cup of tea and a small plate of sandwich. Her kindness felt like water in a desert, and I found myself fighting back tears of gratitude. "Señora Clara," she said softly, glancing around to make sure we weren't overheard, "I want you to know that Señor Eduardo spoke of you and the baby with such joy. Never doubt that you brought him happiness in his final months." Her words were like a lifeline, and I grasped them desperately, storing them away as proof that my marriage had been real, meaningful, worthy of respect. But even as I treasured Rosa's kindness, I couldn't shake the memory of Dona Mercedes' words at the cemetery. The phrase, "that baby will inherit nothing," echoed in my mind like a curse, and I found myself studying the faces around me with new eyes. Who among these people saw Mateo as a threat to their own inheritance? Who had the power to make good on such a threat? As the afternoon wore on, the hostility became more pronounced. Conversations stopped abruptly when I entered a room. Relatives who had been warm to me at the wedding now offered only perfunctory nods. Even the children, Eduardo's young cousins who had played with me during happier visits, seemed to have been coached to keep their distance. The isolation was suffocating, and I found myself retreating to increasingly remote corners of the house, seeking refuge from the collective cold shoulder I was receiving. By evening, most of the mourners had departed, leaving only the immediate family and a few close friends. This should have made things more comfortable, more intimate, but instead it felt like the walls were closing in, without the buffer of distant relatives and family friends. The hostility of Eduardo's closest family members became impossible to ignore. I approached Dona Mercedes as she stood by the fireplace, hoping that in this more private setting we might be able to talk honestly about the future, about Mateo's place in the family, about what Eduardo would have wanted. But as I drew near, she turned her back to me, engaging in animated conversation with Eduardo's brother Carlos about some business matter that apparently required all of her attention. I stood there for several minutes, waiting for a natural break in their conversation, but it became clear that I was being deliberately ignored. The slight was so obvious, so calculated, that I felt heat rise in my cheeks, despite the chill that seemed to permeate the entire house. This wasn't grief making people distant. This was war, and I was apparently the enemy. The realization hit me with stunning clarity. They didn't just dislike me, they were actively working to exclude me and my son from the family legacy. Sleep eluded me that first night back in the house where Eduardo and I had shared our brief but happy marriage. Every creak of the old wooden floors, every whisper of wind against the windows seemed magnified in the darkness. Mateo slept fitfully in his cradle beside my bed, perhaps sensing the tension that filled the air like an electric charge before a storm. I found myself staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of the hostility I had encountered, trying to understand what could have changed so dramatically between the warm welcome I had received as Eduardo's bride and the cold rejection I was experiencing as his widow. When dawn finally broke gray and pale through the frost-covered windows, I decided I needed to do something, anything, to understand my situation better. With Mateo fed and settled, I made my way to Eduardo's study, a room I had rarely entered during our marriage out of respect for his privacy. Now, however, I felt I had not just the right, but the obligation to explore what he had left behind, to understand what provisions he had made for his family. The study was exactly as he had left it, papers scattered across the mahogany desk, books open to pages he would never finish reading, a half-empty coffee cup that Rosa had apparently been afraid to touch. The sight of these intimate remnants of his daily life brought fresh tears to my eyes, but I forced myself to focus on the task at hand. Somewhere in this room, there had to be answers to the questions that were eating at me like acid. I began with the desk drawers, carefully examining each document. Most were routine business correspondence related to the family's vineyard operation, but tucked beneath a stack of invoices, I discovered something that made my heart race. A letter in Eduardo's handwriting, dated just 2 weeks before his death. The paper was expensive, the kind he used for important correspondence, and my name was written at the top in his careful script. "My dearest Clara," it began, "I write this letter with a heavy heart, not because I doubt the love we share, but because I fear what may happen to you and our precious Mateo should something happen to me. My family has never fully accepted our marriage, and I worry that their prejudices may manifest in ways that could threaten your future security. Therefore, I want you to know that I have prepared an important document for little Mateo's future, one that will ensure the letter stopped abruptly in mid-sentence, as if Eduardo had been interrupted while writing it. The pen had been set aside hastily, leaving a small blot of ink where he had lifted it from the paper. I turned the letter over, searching for continuation on the back, but there was nothing. My hands trembled as I read and reread the incomplete message, trying to understand what he had been about to tell me. An important document for Mateo's future. What could that mean? Had Eduardo prepared a will? A trust fund? Some legal protection that would guarantee our security? The fact that he had felt the need to write such a letter at all confirmed my worst fears about his family's intention, but it also gave me hope. Eduardo had been a careful, methodical man. If he had foreseen problems, he would have taken steps to protect us. I searched through every drawer in the desk, examining each paper with increasing desperation, but I found no other personal letters, no will, no legal documents that might explain what Eduardo had been referring to. The business papers were all routine, dealing with vineyard management, wine sales, and equipment purchase. There were bank statements showing healthy balances and accounts that were now presumably frozen, and correspondence with lawyers about business matters that had nothing to do with personal estate planning. As I sat back in Eduardo's leather chair, staring at the incomplete letter that had raised more questions than it answered, I heard footsteps in the hallway outside the study. Quickly, I folded the letter and slipped it into my pocket, not wanting to reveal my discovery to anyone else until I understood its full implication. A moment later, there was a soft knock on the door. and Rosa's kind face appeared in the doorway. "Signora Clara," she said quietly, "are you all right? I saw the light under the door and thought you might need something." Her concern was genuine, and I felt a wave of gratitude for her kindness in this house full of cold hearts. "I'm fine, Rosa, thank you," I replied, though my voice betrayed the emotional turmoil I was experiencing. "I was just trying to understand some of Eduardo's affairs. There's so much I don't know about the family business." Rosa stepped into the room and closed the door behind her, her expression becoming more serious. "Signora, if you don't mind me saying so, I think you should be very careful about asking too many questions right now. There are tensions in this house that go back many years, and your husband's death has stirred up old resentment." "What kind of tensions?" I asked, leaning forward in the chair. Rosa had worked for this family for decades. If anyone understood the dynamics at play, it would be her. She glanced nervously at the door before answering. "The Mendoza family has always been very protective of their wealth, very concerned with keeping everything within the bloodline. When Senor Eduardo married you, it upset certain people who had expectations about how the family fortune would be distributed. Now that he's gone, those same people are worried about what claims you and the baby might have." Her words confirmed what I had already begun to suspect, but hearing it stated so plainly still came as a shock. "But Eduardo was their son, their brother," I protest. "Surely they wouldn't try to cheat his own child out of his inheritance." Rosa's expression grew sad. "Money does terrible things to Signora, even to family, especially to family." She paused, seeming to wrestle with some internal debate, then continued in an even quieter voice. "There have been meetings, late at night, when they think the servants are all asleep. Dona Mercedes, Senor Carlos, Senor Arturo. They've been discussing what to do about the situation." "The situation," I repeated, feeling my anger beginning to build despite my fear. "You and the baby," Rosa explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "They don't see you as family, Signora. They see you as a problem to be solved." The conversation with Rosa haunted me for the rest of the day. Every interaction with Eduardo's family members took on new significance. Every glance and whispered comment adding to my growing certainty that I was indeed facing a conspiracy designed to deprive my son of his rightful inheritance. But knowing about the threat and knowing what to do about it were entirely different matters. I was one person, alone in a house full of enemies, with no knowledge of where Eduardo might have hidden the important documents mentioned in his unfinished letter. That evening, I decided to confront Dona Mercedes directly. I found her in the salon, sitting by the fire with her embroidery, the picture of serene domesticity. The irony wasn't lost on me that someone who appeared so grandmotherly could be plotting against her own grandson's future. I approached her chair with Mateo in my arm, hoping that the sight of her grandchild might soften her heart, might make her remember that beneath all the legal and financial complications, we were still family. "Doña Mercedes," I began, trying to keep my voice steady and respectful. "I was hoping we could talk about the future, about what Eduardo would have wanted for Mateo and me." She looked up from her needlework, her expression carefully neutral. "What about the future, Clara? You're young, you're healthy. I'm sure you'll find your way in the world. Many women have raised children alone." The casual dismissal in her tone was like a slap across the face. "But this is Eduardo's son," I insisted, holding Mateo a little closer. "Surely he has a place in this family, a claim to his father's legacy." "Legacy?" Doña Mercedes' eyebrows rose slightly, as if the word amused her. "What legacy would that be?" Eduardo was a younger son with no particular business acumen. He lived well enough, but he had no substantial assets of his own to leave to anyone. I felt the letter in my pocket like a burning coal against my skin. Eduardo himself had written about preparing for Mateo's, about important documents. Either his mother was lying, or she genuinely didn't know about whatever provisions he had made. But surely there must be something, I pressed. A will, perhaps, or some legal document that outlines his wishes. If there were such a document, Dona Mercedes replied coolly, "I'm sure the family lawyers would have informed us by now. As it stands, Eduardo died intestate, which means any minor assets he possessed will be absorbed back into the family estate according to traditional inheritance. Nothing unusual about that." She was lying. I was certain of. The casual way she dismissed the possibility of a will, the slightly too practiced nature of her explanation about intestate succession, it all felt rehearsed, as if she had prepared these answers in advance. I found something today, deciding to test her reaction. A letter Eduardo was writing, mentioning some important document he had prepared. For just a moment, I saw something flicker behind her eyes. Surprise, fear, guilt. But it was gone so quickly, I might have imagined it. You're grasping at straws, my dear, returning her attention to her embroidery. Grief can make us see meaning where none exists. Perhaps it would be better if you focused on practical matters rather than clinging to illusion. The word illusions hit me like a physical blow. It was clearly chosen to diminish and dismiss, to make me question my own perceptions and memory. But it also confirmed that she knew more than she was admitting. If there truly were no document, no provision, no complications to worry about, why would she be so eager to discourage my inquiry? Why use such loaded language to describe my concerns? I don't think I'm imagining anything, I said, standing up straighter and meeting her gaze directly. Eduardo loved his son. He would never have left him without protection, without provision for his. If such documents exist, I intend to find them. Dona Mercedes set down her needlework and looked at me with something approaching. And what exactly do you think you'll accomplish with such behavior? Do you imagine you can force your way into acceptance? That you can threaten and cajole your way to some imaginary inheritance? Her voice remained quiet, but there was steel in it now. You are not a Mendoza, Claire. You never will be. That child may carry our name, but he carries your blood, and that makes all the difference. The mask had finally slipped, revealing the true depth of her prejudice and hostility. I felt my own anger rising to match her, but I forced myself to remain calm. Losing my temper would only give her more ammunition to use against me. Eduardo didn't seem to think my blood was a problem when he married me, I said quietly, and Mateo is his son, regardless of what you may think of his mother. Eduardo was always too romantic for his own good, she replied dismissively. He made his choice, and now he's gone. The rest of us must deal with the consequences as best we. She picked up her embroidery again, signaling that the conversation was over. I suggest you start thinking about where you want to live and how you plan to support yourself. This house is needed for family business, and I'm afraid there won't be room for extended arrangement. The threat was clear, and it chilled me to the bone. They were going to throw us out, cut us off completely, leave us with nothing. But Eduardo's letter proved that he had anticipated this possibility, had taken steps to protect us. Somewhere, there were documents that would secure Mateo's future. I just had to find them before his family could destroy them or hide them permanently. 2 days after my confrontation with Dona Mercedes, I was sitting in the kitchen nursing Mateo when Rosa approached me with a conspiratorial look. She glanced around nervously before sitting down across from me, her voice barely above a whisper. Señora Clara, there's someone who wants to speak with, someone who might be able to help. She paused, wringing her hands. But you must be very careful. There are eyes everywhere in this house, and if certain people knew he was talking to you, double quotes, my heart began to. Who is it? Joaquin. He was Señor Eduardo's personal assistant for many years, handled all his private affairs. He was dismissed shortly after the funeral, officially for budgetary reasons. But everyone knows it was because he knew too much about the family business. Rosa glanced toward the door again. He's waiting in the old gardener's shed by the greenhouse. He said to tell you that he knows where your husband kept his most important. The news hit me like lightning. If anyone would know about Eduardo's preparations for our future, it would be Joaquin. I had always liked the quiet, efficient man who had managed Eduardo's schedule and correspondence with such discretion. More importantly, Eduardo had trusted him completely, often relying on his advice for both business and personal matters. When can I meet with him? I asked, already planning how to slip away from the house without being noticed. Now, if you can manage it, Rosa replied, but be very careful. Señor Arturo has been watching you closely since yesterday. I think he suspects you're planning something. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Whatever Señor Eduardo left for you and the baby, you must find it quickly. I overheard Dona Mercedes talking to the lawyers this morning about filing papers to have you removed from the house. The urgency in her voice sent a chill down my spine. Time was running out faster than I had realized. I bundled Mateo in his warmest clothes, told Rosa I was taking him for some fresh air to help him sleep, and slipped out through the kitchen door into the gray afternoon. The greenhouse complex was at the far end of the property, partially hidden by a grove of bare-branched fruit trees. The gardener's shed was a small stone building that had seen better days, its roof patched with newer tiles that didn't quite match the original. I knocked softly on the wooden door and heard Joaquin's familiar voice calling me to enter. He looked older than I remembered, his dark hair now showing streaks of silver at the temple, but his eyes were as kind and intelligent as ever. He embraced me briefly, expressing his condolences in the formal manner that had always characterized his, but I could see the genuine emotion expression. Señora Clara, I am so sorry for your loss, and I am sorry it has taken me so long to contact you. I wanted to speak at the funeral, but he gestured helpless. The family made it clear that my presence was no longer welcome. Rosa said, "You know something about Eduardo's papers," I said without preamble. Time was too precious for lengthy social convention. Joaquin nodded gravely. Señor Eduardo was a careful man, especially in his final months. He suspected that his family would not welcome you and the child into the inheritance, and he took steps to protect you both. But he also knew that such documents would not be safe in the main house, where anyone might have access to them. My heart pounded with hope and fear in equal measure. Where did he keep them? There are several locations, Joaquin replied, pulling out a small notebook and flipping through its pages. He was very systematic about it, spreading the documents among different hiding places so that if one was discovered, the others would remain safe. But he hesitated, looking troubled. I must warn you, Señora, there are eyes in all corners of. If you are caught searching for these documents, if anyone realizes what you are doing, they will move quickly to stop you. Some members of your husband's family are not above using extreme measures to protect what they see as their interest. What kind of extreme measures? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. Joaquin's expression grew even more serious. Legal challenges to your marriage. Claims that the child is not legitimate. Accusations about your motives for marrying into the family. They have already been consulting with lawyers about the best way to contest any claims you might make. If they discover that Eduardo did indeed leave specific provisions for you and Mateo, they will fight them with every resource at their disposal. The scope of the conspiracy against us was even worse than I had imagined. They weren't just planning to ignore Eduardo's wishes. They were preparing to destroy us completely if necessary. But knowing the extent of the threat also strengthened my resolve. I would not let them erase my husband's love or steal my son's birthright. Tell me where to look, I said firmly. I'll take whatever risks I have to. Joaquin studied my face for a long moment, then nodded approvingly. The first location is in the wine cellar, behind the rack that holds the 1987 vintage. There's a loose stone in the wall that conceals a small cavity. The second is in the library, inside a hollow space behind the collected works of Cervantes on the third shelf. But be very careful, Señora. Señor Arturo has been spending a great deal of time in the library, and I suspect he may be searching for the same things you are. As if summoned by the mention of his name, I heard footsteps crunching through the dead leaves outside the shed. Joaquin's face went pale, and he quickly closed his notebook and slipped it into his jacket pocket. Someone's coming, he whispered urgently. You must go, now, before they see you here. But it was too late. The door opened, and Eduardo's cousin, Arturo, stepped inside, his sharp features arranged in an expression of false concern. Clara, my dear cousin, he said in a tone that made my skin crawl. What brings you to such an out-of-the-way place on this cold afternoon? Arturo's sudden appearance sent ice through my veins, but I forced myself to remain calm. Showing fear or guilt would only confirm whatever suspicions had brought him here. Instead, I adjusted Mateo in my arms and tried to project an air of innocent. I was just taking the baby for a walk, I said, keeping my voice steady. The fresh air helped him sleep, and I needed to get out of the house for a while. The grief, it can be suffocating sometimes. I gestured toward Joaquin as if noticing him for the first time. I didn't expect to find anyone here. Joaquin played his part well, rising from his chair with what appeared to be genuine surprise. Señora Clara, I didn't hear you come in. I was just collecting some tools I had left here before my employment ended. The family was kind enough to let me retrieve my personal belongings. Arturo's eyes moved between us, calculating, suspicious. He was a lawyer by training, accustomed to detecting deception and inconsistency. I could practically see him weighing our explanation, looking for flaws in our stories. "How fortunate that you should encounter each other by accident," he said, "and how considerate of you, Joaquin, to be so thorough in collecting your tools." The emphasis on the last word made it clear that he didn't believe a word of what he was hearing. My mind raced, trying to think of some way to defuse the situation, to convince him that this meeting was indeed coincidental. But before I could speak, Arturo continued, "Clara, I've been looking for you. There are some legal matters we need to discuss, some papers that require your attention. Why don't you come back to the house with me now? I'm sure Joaquin can finish his business here without further interruption." It wasn't a request, and we all knew it. The threat in his voice was subtle but unmistakable. If I didn't cooperate, if I continued this conversation with Joaquin, there would be consequences. I looked at the older man, trying to communicate my gratitude and my intention to follow up on the information he had given me, then nodded to Arturo. Of course, I was just heading back anyway. I turned to Joaquin and extended my hand in what I hoped appeared to be a polite farewell. "It was good to see you again. Take care of yourself." As we shook hands, he pressed something small and hard into my palm. I managed to palm the object without showing any reaction, though my heart hammered against my ribs. Whatever he had given me, I couldn't examine it with Arturo watching my every move. The walk back to the house felt endless. Arturo maintained a stream of casual conversation, asking about my plans for the future, my thoughts on the family business, my feelings about continuing to live in such a large house now that I was alone. Each question felt like a probe, an attempt to gauge my intentions and discover how much I knew about the family's machinations against me. "You know," he said, as we approached the main entrance, "it occurs to me that this house might hold some difficult memories for you now. Have you given any thought to where you might like to settle? Perhaps somewhere warmer? Somewhere you could make a fresh start with a baby?" The suggestion was couched in concerned language, but the underlying message was clear. They wanted me gone, away from the family seat, away from any documents or evidence that might support claims on Eduardo's estate. "I haven't really thought that far ahead," I replied carefully. "Everything is still so fresh, so raw. I'm just trying to take things one day at a time." Of course," Arturo nodded sympathetically. "But practical matters do require attention, regardless of our emotional state. There are financial considerations, legal obligations, the question of the child's future education and upbringing. These things are easier to handle if one has a clear plan." We had reached the front door, but Arturo made no move to open it. Instead, he turned to face me directly, his expression becoming more serious. "Clara, I want you to know that this family will always feel a responsibility toward Eduardo's widow and child. We may not have been as welcoming as we should have been. Grief affects people differently, and sometimes it brings out our worst impulses. But that doesn't mean we don't care about your well-being." His words would have been reassuring if I hadn't overheard his grandmother's comments at the funeral, if I hadn't witnessed the family's coordinated hostility over the past few days, if I hadn't just caught him following me to spy on my private conversation. As it was, his sudden show of concern felt like a trap being baited. "That's very kind of you to say," I replied neutrally, not wanting to commit to anything but also not wanting to openly challenge his false sincerity. "In fact," he continued, "I've been thinking that it might be beneficial for all of us to sit down with the family lawyers and discuss the various options available to. There may be trust funds that could be established, monthly stipends that could be arranged, educational provisions that could be made for the boy. Nothing elaborate, you understand, but enough to ensure a comfortable life." The offer sounded generous on the surface, but I recognized it for what it truly was. A bribe. They were prepared to offer me some financial settlement in exchange for giving up any claims to Eduardo's real estate or business. It was probably more than they wanted to give, but far less than what Eduardo had intended for his son to inherit. "I appreciate the thought," I said, finally reaching for the door handle myself. "But as I said, I'm not ready to make any major decisions right now. When I am, I'll certainly want to consult with my own legal counsel to make sure I understand all the implications." Arturo's expression tightened almost imperceptibly at the mention of independent legal advice. "Of course, that's your right. Though I should mention that the family has worked with the same law firm for decades. They understand our affairs better than any outsider could, and they would be in the best position to arrange something that benefits everyone. The message was becoming clearer by the moment. They wanted to control every aspect of any settlement, using lawyers who were already in their pocket to craft agreements that would favor the family's interests over mine and Mateo's. I'll keep that in mind, I said diplomatically, opening the door and stepping into the warm foyer. As we parted ways inside the house, I slipped my hand into my pocket and felt the object Joaquin had passed to. It was small and metallic, with an irregular shape that felt familiar under my fingers. A key. He had given me a key, but to what? And more importantly, when would I have the opportunity to use it without Arturo or the rest of the family realizing what I was doing? That night, after Mateo was asleep and the house had settled into quiet, I examined the key by lamplight. It was old, made of brass that had tarnished with age, and it bore no markings or numbers that might indicate what lock it was designed to open. But somehow, looking at it, I felt a connection to Eduardo, as if this small piece of metal was a message from beyond the grave, a reminder that he had indeed prepared for our future, had tried to protect us from exactly the situation we now faced. The blizzard began just after midnight, the wind howling around the house like a living thing seeking entry. I stood at my bedroom window, watching the snow swirl in violent eddies, illuminated by the security lights that cast everything in harsh, white relief. The storm would provide perfect cover for what I needed to do, but it would also make any movement through the house more dangerous. Every creak of settling timber, every rattle of windows would be amplified by the howling wind, making it nearly impossible to move quietly. But I couldn't wait any longer. Arturo's discovery of my meeting with Joaquin had accelerated whatever timeline the family was working on. I had overheard whispered conversations in the hallway outside my room, fragments of urgent discussion about moving quickly and taking care of the situation before it becomes more complicated. If there were documents hidden in the locations Joaquin had mentioned, I needed to find them tonight, before the family realized what I was looking for and moved to destroy the evidence. Mateo was sleeping soundly, exhausted by the day's emotional turbulence. I wrapped him warmly and placed him in the portable bassinet that could accompany me if necessary. If I were caught searching the house, I might not be able to return to this room, and I refused to leave him alone and defenseless while his inheritance was being stolen from under us. The first location Joaquin had mentioned was the wine cellar, behind the rack holding the 1987 vintage. The cellar was in the basement, accessed through a door off the kitchen, which meant I would have to traverse the entire house, but it also meant that any sounds I made would be muffled by layers of stone and earth, hidden beneath the wind's fury. I slipped out of my room and into the darkened hallway, carrying Mateo's bassinet in one hand and a small flashlight in the other. The house felt different in the storms, larger somehow, full of shadows that seemed to move independently of my light. Every portrait on the walls appeared to be watching me, the eyes of Eduardo's ancestors following my progress with disapproval and suspicion. The kitchen was mercifully empty, though I could see Rosa's small apartment beyond it was dark. I didn't want to involve her further in my desperate. She had already risked enough by facilitating my meeting with Joaquin. The cellar door was heavy oak, its hinges well-oiled despite the age of the house. It opened silently, revealing stone steps that descended into blackness. The wine cellar was extensive, reflecting generations of careful collection and preservation. Hundreds of bottles lined the walls in wooden racks, organized by vintage and region with meticulous precision. I moved carefully through the narrow aisles, my flashlight beam dancing across labels and years, searching for the section that held the 1987 vintage. I found it in the deepest part of the cellar, where the temperature was most consistent, and the bottles could age undisturbed for decades. The rack was built into the stone wall itself, and as I examined it more closely, I could see that one section looked slightly different from the others. The mortar between certain stones was a shade lighter, as if it had been recently replaced. Setting Mateo's bassinet on the floor where he would be safe, I began running my hands along the wall behind the wine rack, feeling for the loose stone Joaquin had described. The cold seeped through my fingertip, numbing them, but I persisted, pressing against each stone in turn until I found one that shifted slightly under pressure. It took several minutes of careful work to wiggle the stone free without causing noise that might carry upstairs. When it finally came loose, it revealed a cavity about the size of a shoebox, lined with oiled cloth to protect its contents from moisture. Inside, I found a manila envelope sealed with wax, Eduardo's personal seal pressed into the red surface. My hands shook as I broke the seal and extracted the documents inside. The first was a letter addressed to, dated just days before Eduardo's death. The second was a legal document bearing official seals and signature. Even in the dim light of my flashlight, I could see enough to understand that Eduardo had indeed prepared for our future, had taken legal steps to ensure that Mateo would inherit not just money, but specific properties and business interests. But as I tried to read more carefully, I heard something that made my blood freeze. Footsteps on the stairs leading down to the cellar. Someone else was moving through the house in the storm. Someone who had discovered my absence and followed me into the depths of the building. I quickly stuffed the documents back into the envelope and slipped it inside my coat, then replaced the stone as quietly as possible. Whoever was coming would find the wine cellar exactly as it had been, with no sign that I had discovered anything. But they would also find me here, and I needed a plausible explanation for my presence. The footsteps were closer now, accompanied by the beam of another flashlight cutting through the darkness. I picked up Mateo's bassinet and moved toward the stairs, hoping to encounter whoever was coming before they reached the deepest parts of the cellar where my search had taken place. It was Arturo, dressed in a heavy robe and carrying a much more powerful flashlight than my own. His face showed no surprise at finding me in the cellar, which suggested he had been watching for some time, waiting for me to make exactly this kind of move. "Clara," he said, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "What are you doing down here at this hour? And in such weather?" I forced my expression into what I hoped looked like embarrassment at being caught in a moment of weakness. "I couldn't sleep," I said, which was certainly the storm, the stress of everything that's happened. I thought perhaps a glass of wine might help. Eduardo always said that this cellar held the finest collection in the region. Arturo's flashlight beams swept the area around me, clearly searching for signs of disturbance. "And you brought the baby down into this cold, damp place. That seems, unwise." "I didn't want to leave him alone upstairs," I replied, which was also true. With the storm making so much noise, I might not hear him if he needed me. I started moving toward the stairs, hoping to end this confrontation before it could develop into something more dangerous. But Arturo didn't move aside to let me pass. Instead, he stepped closer, his expression becoming more threatening. "Clara, I think it's time we spoke honestly with each other. I know why you're really here, what you're really looking for, and I want you to understand that whatever you think you might find, whatever games you think you're playing, they will not succeed." The pretense of family concern had finally dropped completely. We were now facing each other as open adversaries, and I realized that my situation had become far more dangerous than I had imagined. "I don't know what you mean," I said, trying to maintain the fiction of innocence, even though we both knew it was. "Eduardo was my cousin," Arturo continued, ignoring my denial. "I loved him like a brother. But he was also naive about certain things, romantic in ways that sometimes clouded his judgment. If he made promises to you, if he led you to believe things about your future in this family, then I'm sorry. But promises from the dead carry no legal weight, especially when they conflict with established family interests." His words confirmed everything I had suspected about the families, but they also revealed something else. They weren't entirely certain about what Eduardo had or hadn't done to protect us. If they had been sure that no documents existed, Arturo wouldn't be here now, wouldn't be watching my every move with such intensity. "You should accept what we're prepared to offer," he continued, his voice taking on a harder edge. "It's generous, more than generous, considering your situation. But if you continue this foolish search, if you persist in these fantasies about inheritance and family legacy, things will become much more difficult for everyone involved." The threat was clear, but so was the fear underlying it. They were afraid of what I might find, afraid that Eduardo had indeed left provisions that would upset their carefully planned appropriation of his estate. The documents in my coat felt like fire against my chest, proof that their fears were justified, that Eduardo's love for his son had been stronger than their greed. "I think you should let me pass now," I said quietly, pulling Mateo's bassinet closer to my body. "It's late, and we're both cold, and whatever discussions need to happen can wait until morning." For a moment, I thought Arturo might try to physically prevent me from leaving the cellar. His hand moved toward me as if to grab my arm, and I prepared to scream, to fight, to do whatever was necessary to protect myself and the evidence I now carried. But then he stepped aside, though his expression promised that this confrontation was far from over. "Until morning then," he agreed. "But Clara, I want you to think carefully about your choices. This family has resources you can't imagine, connections that reach into every aspect of law and business in this region. Whatever you think you might accomplish, we can make it much more difficult than it needs to." Back in my room, I waited until I was certain Arturo had returned to his own quarters before examining the documents I had recovered. The storm continued to rage outside, providing sound cover as I spread the papers on my bed and studied them by lamplight. Eduardo's letter to me was heartbreaking in its prescience and its love. He had written it knowing that his family would likely reject us, knowing that his sudden death would leave us vulnerable to their greed and prejudice. But more importantly, he had taken concrete steps to protect us, consulting with an independent lawyer in the provincial capital to draft documents that would be beyond his family's immediate control. The legal document was a comprehensive will and trust agreement, establishing Mateo as the primary heir to Eduardo's portion of the family vineyard, to his personal bank account, and to several pieces of real estate that had been gifts from his grandfather. The provisions were ironclad, witnessed by multiple parties, and filed with both local and regional authorities to prevent any claims of fraud or forgery. But as I read more carefully, I realized that Eduardo had been even more thorough in his preparation. The document contained specific clauses designed to prevent exactly the kind of family interference we were now facing. If anyone attempted to contest the will or challenge Mateo's legitimacy, they would trigger penalties that would significantly increase his inheritance at the expense of other family members. There was also a sealed letter addressed to the provincial governor, a man who had been Eduardo's friend since university. The letter was to be opened only in the event that the family attempted to use their local connections to subvert the legal process. Eduardo had clearly understood that his mother and cousins would not accept defeat gracefully, and he had prepared countermeasures for their likely strategy. The most shocking revelation came in the final pages of the document. Eduardo had known about his heart condition for months before his death, had been warned by doctors that stress or overexertion could trigger a fatal episode. His family had known this too, which explained their confidence that they wouldn't have to deal with him for much longer. What they hadn't known was that Eduardo had used the time to prepare for exactly this scenario, consulting with lawyers and financial advisors to create an unbreakable legal framework for his son's future. As I absorbed the full implications of what I had found, I heard new sounds in the house above me, voices urgent and angry, coming from the direction of Dona Mercedes. The confrontation in the cellar had apparently prompted immediate action, and I could guess what was being discussed: how to prevent me from using whatever information I had discovered, how to discredit or destroy any documents that might threaten their plans. I needed to act quickly. The documents I had found were copies. Eduardo had been careful to ensure that the originals were safely filed with his lawyer in the capital, but these copies were still dangerous to the family's still proof that their claims about Eduardo dying intestate were deliberate lies. If they realized I had found them, they would move immediately to either steal them back or have me arrested on false charges that would discredit anything I might try to present in court. The key Joaquin had given me was still in my pocket, and I remembered his mention of a second location, the library, behind the collected works of Cervantes. If there were additional documents hidden there, documents that might provide even more protection or reveal other aspects of Eduardo's preparation, I needed to find them before the family realized how much I now knew. But the library was on the main floor of the house, in the section where the family spent most of their evening hours. Reaching it undetected would be much more difficult than getting to the wine cellar had been, especially now that they were clearly on high alert for any unusual activity on my part. The storm was reaching its peak intensity, the wind driving snow against the windows with such force that the glass rattled in its frames. The house's heating system struggled against the cold, and I could hear the old furnace cycling on and off as it fought to maintain temperature. If I was going to make another attempt at searching the hidden location, I needed to do it now, while the storm provided maximum cover, and before the family could organize a more systematic watch over my movements. I bundled Matteo warmly again, though this time I decided to risk leaving him in his room. The library search would be more dangerous, requiring stealth and speed that would be impossible with a bassinet to carry. But I also knew that if I were caught, if this night's activities led to my immediate expulsion from the house, I might not have another chance to return for it. The hallway outside my room was empty, but I could see lights spilling from under several doors, indicating that various family members were awake and probably planning their response to whatever they suspected I had discovered. I moved as quietly as possible toward the main staircase, avoiding the boards that I had learned would creak under pressure. The library was a grand room on the first floor, its walls lined floor to ceiling with books collected over generations. The collected works of Cervantes would be in the literature section, probably on one of the middle shelves where they would be easily accessible but not obviously prominent. I slipped through the door and closed it behind me, then began searching with my small flashlight for the familiar spines of the classic Spanish author. I found them on the third shelf, exactly where Joaquin had indicated. The volumes were bound in matching leather, showing their age and the wear of regular handling. As I examined them more closely, I could see that one volume, the second part of Don Quixote, was slightly out of alignment with the others, as if it had been recently removed and replaced. The book came away from the shelf easily, revealing that it was actually a hollow container designed to look like a genuine volume. Inside the false book, I found another key, this one newer and more complex than the one Joaquin had given me, along with a small map drawn in Eduardo's handwriting. The map showed the layout of the family's country house, a property about 20 miles from the main estate that was used primarily for hunting and summer retreat. Certain rooms were marked with symbols, and a path was drawn from the main house to a small building that appeared to be some kind of storage facility or workshop. As I studied the map more carefully, trying to understand what Eduardo had hidden at the country house and how I might access, I heard footsteps in the corridor outside the library. They were moving purposefully, not the casual pace of someone going about normal household business. Someone was looking for me, and they were checking rooms systematically. I quickly returned the false book to its place on the shelf and moved toward the window that looked out over the front gardens. The storm was still raging, but there was enough light from the house's exterior fixture to see that the drive was completely blocked by snow. Even if I could reach the country house, getting there in current conditions would be nearly impossible. The footsteps had stopped outside the library door. I could see the shadow of feet in the light that crept under the doorframe, and I knew that whoever was there was listening, trying to determine if the room was occupied. I held my breath, pressing myself against the heavy curtains that covered the window, hoping that my flashlight hadn't been visible from the corridor. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps moved on, continuing down the hallway toward other rooms. But I knew that my time was running out. The family was actively hunting for me now, and it would only be a matter of time before they found me or decided to take more direct action to prevent me from using whatever information I had discovered. I needed to get to the country house, needed to find whatever Eduardo had hidden there before his family could intercept me. But first, I had to survive this night, had to evade their surveillance long enough to plan my next move. The documents I had found were damning proof of their deception, but they would be useless if I couldn't live long enough to present them to independent authorities. The next morning dawned gray and bitter, the storm having left behind a landscape transformed into an Arctic wasteland. Snow had piled against the windows of the house in sculptural drift, and the wind, though diminished, still moaned through the bare branches of the trees with a sound like mourning. I stood at my bedroom window, watching the groundskeepers attempt to clear the main drive with snowplows, knowing that my window for action was closing rapidly. During the night, I had heard vehicles arriving despite the storm, the crunch of tires on snow, the slam of car doors, voices conferring in urgent whispers outside. The family had called in reinforcement, probably lawyers and perhaps private investigators who specialized in dealing with difficult inheritance situations. My amateur attempts at stealth and secrecy were about to be overwhelmed by professional opposition. Matteo was fussy, sensing the tension that filled the house like electricity before a storm. I fed him and changed him, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy while my mind raced through possible scenarios. The documents I had found were safely hidden in my room, but they were useless as long as I remained trapped in this house, surrounded by hostile family members. I needed to reach the provincial capital, needed to contact Eduardo's independent lawyer and the authorities who could enforce his will. A soft knock on my door interrupted my anxious planning. "Señora Clara." It was Rosa's voice, carefully neutral but somehow conveying urgency. "Dona Mercedes requests your presence in the main salon. She says there are matters that require immediate The summons was not unexpected, but it still sent a chill through. Whatever plan the family had developed during their nighttime conferences, they were ready to implement it. I wrapped Matteo in his warmest clothes and made my way downstairs, acutely aware that this might be my last opportunity to move freely through the house that had been my home. The main salon had been transformed into something resembling a courtroom. Dona Mercedes sat in the largest chair, flanked by two men in expensive suits whom I didn't recognize. Arturo stood near the fireplace, his expression grim but satisfied. Several other family members were present, creating an atmosphere of formal intimidation that was clearly designed to overwhelm any resistance I might offer. "Clara, dear," Dona Mercedes began, her voice carrying false warmth that barely concealed the steel beneath. "We've asked you here because we're concerned about your well-being and that of the child. Recent events have suggested that grief may be affecting your judgment, leading you to actions that could be harmful to everyone involved." I remained standing, holding Matteo protectively, refusing to take the seat they had obviously prepared for me. "What actions are you referring to?" One of the suited men stepped forward, introducing himself as a family lawyer, with a name I immediately forgot. "Mrs. Mendoza, we understand you've been searching through the house at unusual hours, looking for documents related to your late husband's estate. We want you to know that such actions are not only unnecessary, but potentially damaging to your own interest." The lie was smoothly delivered, designed to make my legitimate search for Eduardo's will sound like the desperate actions of a delusional widow. "I was simply trying to understand my situation," I replied carefully. "My husband died suddenly, and no one has been willing to discuss what provisions he might have made for his family. That's precisely what we're here to address," the lawyer continued, opening a briefcase and removing several official-looking documents. "Mr. Eduardo Mendoza died intestate, without any formal will or testament. Under these circumstances, his estate will be distributed according to standard inheritance, which provide for modest provisions for surviving spouses and minor children, but reserve the bulk of family assets for blood relatives who can continue the family business." Another lie, delivered with the same professional confidence. They were counting on my ignorance of legal procedures, hoping that their authoritative presentation would convince me to accept whatever settlement they were prepared to offer. "I find it hard to believe that Eduardo made no provisions for his son," I said, watching their faces carefully for any reaction. "Your husband was a romantic, Mrs. Mendoza," Arturo interjected, "but not a particularly practical man when it came to legal matters. He may have mentioned intentions to you, may have spoken about future plans, but good intentions are not the same as executed documents." The second lawyer, who had remained silent until now, cleared his throat. "However, this family recognizes its moral obligation to you and the child. We're prepared to offer a settlement that will ensure your comfortable support for the foreseeable future, along with educational provisions for the boy when he comes of age." He slid a document across the coffee table toward me. Even from a distance, I could see that it was a contract of some kind, dense with legal language and bearing spaces for multiple signatures. This agreement would provide you with a monthly stipend, a trust fund for the child's education, and a lump sum payment that would allow you to establish yourself independently in any city of your choosing. The offer was certainly more generous than I had expected, but the conditions attached to it were clearly designed to remove me and Matteo from any claim on the family's primary asset. More importantly, accepting their settlement would mean acknowledging that Eduardo had made no legal provisions for us, legitimizing their theft of his intention. I appreciate the family's concern, I said carefully, but this is a significant decision that affects my son's entire future. I would need time to review these documents with independent legal counsel before signing anything. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Dona Mercedes' mask of grandmotherly concern slipped slightly, revealing the calculating businesswoman beneath. Clara, you must understand that this offer represents the family's goodwill, but goodwill has its limits. If you choose to contest our reasonable settlement, if you attempt to make claims that lack any legal foundation, the situation could become much more complicated. The threat was clear, and it was backed by the kind of resources and connections that could make my life very difficult indeed. But I also knew something they didn't, that Eduardo's real will was already filed with authorities beyond their immediate control, that their confident assertions about his dying intestate were about to be challenged by legal documents they couldn't suppress or destroy. What kind of complications? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. The first lawyer answered with a kind of clinical detachment that made legal threats sound like weather reports. Challenges to the validity of your marriage, questions about the child's paternity, investigations into your motivations for marrying into the family. These matters can become quite unpleasant when they're examined in court. It would be far better for everyone, especially for the child, if we could resolve things amicably. The attack on Matteo's legitimacy was the final straw. Whatever fear I had been feeling transformed into something harder and more focused. These people were prepared to destroy an innocent child's reputation to protect their financial interests, and that made them not just greedy, but genuinely evil. I think I've heard enough, I said, standing and moving toward the door. When I'm ready to discuss my son's future, I'll do so through my own legal representation. Until then, I have nothing more to say to any of you. Clara, Arturo called after me, his voice carrying a new edge of menace. I hope you'll reconsider. This house can be a very lonely place for someone who refuses the family's friendship. As I climbed the stairs back to my room, I realized that the battle lines had been drawn clearly. The family was prepared to use any means necessary to deprive Matteo of his inheritance, but they had underestimated both my determination and Eduardo's foresight. The storm outside was finally beginning to clear, and soon the roads would be passable again. When they were, I would make my move toward the country house and whatever final secrets Eduardo had hidden there. The retaliation came sooner than I had anticipated. That afternoon, as I was packing essential items for Matteo and myself, Rosa appeared at my door with tears in her eyes and an expression of barely controlled panic. Signora Clara, you must listen to me very carefully, she whispered, glancing nervously down the hallway. They are planning something terrible. I heard them talking in the kitchen. They're going to call the authorities, claim that you're having a mental breakdown, that you're a danger to yourself and the baby. The news hit me like a physical blow. It was a brilliant strategy from their perspective. If they could have me declared mentally incompetent, they could take custody of Matteo as his nearest relative, eliminating both obstacles to their inheritance in one move. Any claims I might make about hidden documents or Eduardo's true intentions would be dismissed as the delusions of an unstable woman. When? I asked, my mind already racing through possible escape scenarios. Soon. Maybe within the hour. Senator Arturo left in his car as soon as the roads were cleared enough for travel. I think he went to the provincial offices to file the necessary papers. Rosa wrung her hands, anxious. Signora, if they succeed in this, if they convince the authorities that you're unfit to care for the child, you may never see him again. The urgency of the situation crystallized my resolve. I could no longer afford to wait for perfect conditions or optimal timing. If I was going to reach the country house and find whatever final evidence Eduardo had left there, I had to leave immediately, before Arturo returned with whatever legal instruments he was arranging. Rosa, I need your help, I said, pulling her into the room and closing the door behind her. I know you've already risked enough for me, but I have nowhere else to. Her loyalty to Eduardo's memory won out over her fear of the family's displeasure. What do you need? I have to get to the country. Eduardo left something there. Something that will prove his real intentions for Mateo's future. But I can't take the main roads. They'll be watching for me, and Arturo will intercept me before I can find what I'm looking for. Rosa nodded, understanding immediately. There's an old service road that connects the properties, used mainly by maintenance crews and hunting parties. It's rough, especially in winter, but it's passable with the right vehicle. My brother Carlos has a truck with four-wheel drive. He uses it for his construction business. I think I can convince him to help. The plan was dangerous, requiring me to trust people I barely knew, and to venture out into treacherous conditions with a newborn baby. But it was also our only hope. If I remained in the house, I would soon find myself in custody, declared incompetent and separated from my son. Whatever risks lay ahead, they were preferable to that certain defeat. There's something else, I said, making a decision that I knew would irrevocably commit me to this course of action. I need you to know that Eduardo didn't die intestate. He left a will, a detailed document that provides for Mateo's future. I found copies of it last night, and I know where the originals are filed. But if the family succeeds in having me declared mentally unstable, no one will believe my testimony about what Eduardo intended. Rosa's eyes widened with a mixture of vindication and fear. She had clearly suspected that the family's claims about Eduardo's lack of planning were false, but having those suspicions confirmed put her in real danger. If the family discovered that she had knowledge of the will's existence, they would view her as a threat to be eliminated. Where are these documents now? She asked. I showed her the hiding place I had created in Mateo's diaper bag, sewn into the lining where casual inspection would never reveal them. If something happens to me, if they succeed in separating us, promise me you'll find a way to get these to the provincial authorities. There's contact information for Eduardo's lawyer in the capital. He has the originals and the power to enforce them. Rosa took the information with the solemnity of someone accepting a sacred trust. I promise, Signora. But nothing will happen to you. We'll get you to the country. You'll find whatever evidence Señor Eduardo left there. And then we'll make sure the whole world knows the truth about what this family has done. Her confidence was reassuring, even though we both knew the odds were stacked heavily against us. The Mendoza family had wealth, connections, and decades of experience in protecting their interests from outsiders. We had courage, determination, and the truth, which might be enough. If we could stay alive and free long enough to present our case. The sound of vehicles in the drive below sent us both rushing to the window. Two official-looking cars had arrived, along with what appeared to be an ambulance. Men in uniforms were getting out, conferring with Dona Mercedes and the lawyers who had remained at the house after the morning's confrontation. They're moving faster than we expected, Rosa said grimly. We have to go now, while they're still organizing downstairs. I grabbed the diaper bag with its hidden documents and the few essential items I had packed, then lifted Mateo from his cradle. He was sleeping peacefully, unaware that his future hung in the balance of the next few hours. As we prepared to leave the room that had been our sanctuary, I took one last look around, wondering if I would ever see it again. There's a service entrance through the pantry, Rosa explained as we moved quietly down the back stairs. Carlos is waiting with his truck just beyond the kitchen garden. If we can reach him without being seen, we'll have a head start before anyone realizes you're gone. The kitchen was empty, but we could hear voices from the main part of the house. Official-sounding conversations about legal procedures and medical evaluation. The trap was being set with professional efficiency, and in minutes it would spring shut. Our only chance was to be gone before they realized their prey had escaped. We slipped through the pantry and out the service door into the bitter afternoon air. The snow crunched under our feet, each step sounding impossibly loud in the stillness. Carlos's truck was waiting exactly where Rosa had promised, its engine running and exhaust creating a cloud of vapor in the cold air. Carlos himself was a weathered man in his 50s, with the kind face and steady demeanor of someone who had spent his life solving practical problems. He asked no questions as Rosa helped me into the cab of the truck, simply nodded when she explained that we needed to reach the country house without using the main roads. It'll be rough going, he warned as we pulled away from the house. That old service road hasn't been maintained in years, and with all this snow, we might get stuck or worse. Are you sure this is worth the risk? I looked down at Matteo, sleeping peacefully in my arms, despite the truck's jolting movement, and thought about the documents hidden in his diaper bag, about Eduardo's love and sacrifice, about the future that was being stolen from an innocent child by people who valued money more than family. Yes, I said firmly, it's worth any risk. As we drove deeper into the forest that separated the main estate from the country house, I could see lights beginning to appear in the windows of the house we had left behind. Soon, they would discover my absence, would realize that their carefully laid plans had been disrupted. The hunt would begin in earnest, and whatever sanctuary the country house might provide would be temporary at best. But Eduardo had chosen this location for a reason, had hidden his most important secrets in a place that would be difficult for his family to access or control. If I could find what he had left there, if I could uncover the final pieces of his protective strategy, there might still be hope for justice, for truth, for the future he had envisioned for his son. The truck lurched through another snowdrift, and I held Matteo closer, whispering promises I hoped I would be able to keep.